Good evening. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Sher-Gil Arts Foundation. My name is Latika Gupta and I work at the foundation as Director of Projects. To briefly introduce the foundation, SSAF, it was established in 2016 with the mandate to carry forward the legacy of scholar and photographer Umrao Singh Sher-Gil, his daughter and a pioneering figure of modern Indian art, Amrita Sher-Gil, and her nephew and niece, artist Vivan Sundaram, and filmmaker and television journalist Navina Sundaram. Since its inception, the foundation's mandate has been to support and enable conjunctions of artistic and cultural practice that deal with historical memory, with a view towards futurities that are based on secular principles and freedom of expression. SSAF is committed to advancing creative independence and supporting alternative and heterodox practices. And I'd encourage all of you to visit our website, ssaf.in, for a glimpse of our programs. For instance, just to mention a couple, the SSAF Asia Art Archive Research Grant and our publications program, SSAF Tulika Books. The SSAF Lab, which is hosting the event, was set up as an incubatory space for discursive, processual, and experimental strategies of practice. It lends itself to interdisciplinary dialogue through multiple formats, such as workshops, talks, symposiums, screenings, and longer duration practice-based projects that further the objectives of the SSAF. Citizenship and its Discontents, this evening's panel, is the first in a series of discussions curated by Subasri Krishnan for the SSAF Lab. It includes academics, lawyers, poets, and filmmakers whose work critically engages with borders, the nation state, and the partition of the Indian subcontinent. It is part of Subasri's larger multi-format research project, Facing History and Ourselves, that asks questions that couldn't be more crucial than at this juncture. We are all acutely aware of the civil rights movement across India from December 2019 against the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, and the National Register of Citizens, NRC, which puts the onus of proving the right to one's country on the individual, rather than the principle of citizenship as an assumed right for the generations of different communities who live within the borders of the country. The NRC in Assam has a longer history that is rooted in the partition of the subcontinent and the migrations that ensued. Just 2 days ago, I read that the Guwahati High Court set aside an ex parte order by a foreigners tribunal declaring a resident of the Moregaon district as a foreigner, holding that citizenship is an important right of a person, which the tribunal, as the news report stated, should have been decided on merits. Now, the Moregaon Tribunal is just one among Assam's 100 such bodies that are mandated to adjudicate on the citizenship of those people who have been marked as suspected foreigners by the border police, or listed as doubtful voters, DV, in electoral rolls. What does it mean to be a citizen? Cultural theorist and filmmaker Ariella Azule conceptualizes, and I quote her, citizenship as a framework of partnership and solidarity among those who are governed. A framework that is neither constituted nor circumscribed by the sovereign. And there is a duty towards, foremost duty towards one another, rather than towards the ruling power, close quotes. Azule proposes that our civic duty is foremost towards those who have been dispossessed, excluded, and most often violently from state discourses that hinge on legal definitions of what it means to belong to a place or to a community. And this turning of our attention towards the marginalized and dispossessed, Azule proposes, can, and I quote her again, enable the rethinking of the concept and practice of citizenship itself. Facing History and Ourselves foregrounds oral testimonies as a mode of creating alternative histories of people and places, along with material traces that enable a historical memory of belonging, alongside ethnic, religious, and linguistic categories, as a way to start building an archive of people and their lives beyond the categories mandated by the nation state. As most of you may already know, Subasri Krishnan is a filmmaker whose work engages with questions of citizenship through the lens of memory, migration, and testimony. Her films include Brave New Medium, which was on internet censorship in Southeast Asia. This or that particular person about official identity documents and the Azad. What the fields remember about the Nelly massacre in Assam in 1983. Sikrini Mwafzanai, Dance of the Butterfly, about a disappearing form of music in the Chirang district in Assam. And her forthcoming film, Shadow Lines, explores questions of citizenship and nationhood in contemporary Assam through the NRC exercise. She also leads the media lab at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements and is a part of the team that curates the Urban Lens Film Festival. And before I hand over to Subasri, who will speak about the project and also introduce the panelists, a few housekeeping points. I would like to point out that this event is being recorded. We request the audience to keep their audio and video off throughout the event, please. Please put your questions in the chat box, which you will see at the bottom of your screen. And these will be moderated and addressed by the panelists in the last 20 minutes or so. Over to you, Subasri.
Thank you so much, Latika, for introducing the larger idea of this project and also introducing me. Good evening to everyone, or good afternoon, or I don't want to say good night, but whichever part of the world you're welcome. It's lovely to see so many of you in this virtual space from different parts of the world and to come kind of be part of this shared space to think about some of these questions. Before I get into introducing the panelists, just a few things. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation for supporting this project, Facing History Ourselves. It's very rare that you find places, especially at this moment in the country, people who come on board and say, we're part of this together. So thank you for being such great collaborators. And in particular, I'd like to thank Gayatri, Malvika, Saurav, and Latika for bringing this panel together along with me. I don't want to take up too much time, but just to say Facing History and Ourselves is an attempt to interrogate everyday concepts that we use in our lives, like questions like citizenship, nation state, borders, right? Terms that we all take for granted and is embedded within us through the official identity document regimes that we're all part of and participate in. I personally have been looking at some of these ideas for about a decade now through my films in Assam, in some parts of Northeast India. I've been looking at some of these questions and I've been trying to find ways to think about them and represent them in the visual form with all its complexity and locations of privilege that we're all and I am a part of. I think very often we think of the category of citizenship and a claim to it through only the official identity documents, right? And all of those who fall outside of it are either termed as illegal immigrant or refugee and what have you. So what this project, Facing History and Ourselves, is trying to do is a small attempt to broaden our understanding of these categories, which have historically been constructed over a period of time, I mean, late 18th century onwards, I would say. And there is a deep violence embedded in them. And we see it not just in India, but in South Asia and all over the world, what these categories have come to mean and the effect they have in the lives of individuals and communities. What I'm trying to do through this work, Facing History and Ourselves, which is an oral testimony project and the panel discussions, is to think of it not just within the confines of borders or nation state, but to look at other ways in which people have made a claim to presence in a place. I think I'm personally far more comfortable with the idea of presence, right? To look at this idea of presence in a place outside the legal and bureaucratic regimes that we're part of, because citizenship is always demanding evidence out of people. And I want to propose and say, and it's just not just me, many people have been thinking about it. How do we think of this outside of the idea of evidence, but can we think of this idea through the idea of presence? So coming to the project itself that SSAF is supporting, it's divided into two parts. The first part of the project is 3 panel discussions, of which this one, Citizenship and its Discontents, is the first one, will be panel discussions with academics, poets, lawyers. So the first one is this one, where we will be looking at larger ideas of citizenship and borders, and how have people through the individual ways negotiated with it inside and actually outside of it, and the role of actually culture or poetry or objects in creating that world. The second one, which hopefully will take place in the next month or so, is called Trails of Partition, Assam and the NRC, where we will be looking at very directly of the history of this question in Assam and what the partition has left in its wake. And the third panel discussion will be actually a set of film screenings where filmmakers have engaged with some of these questions, and we will be talking to the filmmakers. So that's part 1 of the series. Part 2 of the series actually will contain oral testimonies, audio-visual oral testimonies that I will be undertaking in Assam, which will basically be about the afterlife of people who were incarcerated and have spent time in detention centers, and they were deemed as foreigners by the Foreigners Tribunal, because I do think that there's an event that takes place and everybody's gaze and attention is there, but once the event gets over, what does it leave in its wake? That's something I'm interested in. So that is the project. But now to come to the heart of why we're all here today, let me introduce you the panel discussants. Thank you so much, Sahana, Rupali, Malini and Abdul. I know you're all in different parts of the world. Rupali is also unwell, but she still joined us. It's close to 10 o'clock at night for Malini and 8 o'clock for Shana, and Abdul was somewhere else, had to leave something, and has managed to find internet connection, be here. Deep gratitude to you all for being so generous with yourselves and your time, and so readily agreeing to be part of this journey. And on a personal note, also to say that each of your work has been a lodestar for me to think about these questions. So thank you. To introduce everyone, Malini. Malini Sur is a senior lecturer in anthropology at Western Sydney University. She's the author of Jungle Passports, Fences, Mobility and Citizenship at the Northeast India-Bangladesh border. She's also published on borderlands and cultural anthropology, comparative studies in society and history, and modern Asian studies. Malini's fieldwork photographs in South Asia's borders have been exhibited in Amsterdam, Berlin, Bonn, Chiang Mai, Göttingen, Heidelberg, Kathmandu, and Munich. Welcome, Malini. Abdul Kalam Azad is a human rights researcher, community organizer, and writer. Currently, he's writing his doctoral thesis in Vrije University in Amsterdam. He's been working on a number of research projects on the citizenship crisis in Assam in collaboration with various universities. He's one of the co-investigators in the University of York project. The project is called Reimagining Citizenship, the Politics of India's Amended Citizenship Laws. He's previously worked as a research fellow with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. We also will have with us today Rupali. Rupali Samuel is a human rights lawyer, leading litigation work at Parichay, a collaborative legal aid clinic among law universities across India. Her work focuses on citizenship and statelessness law in India, with an emphasis on citizenship determination cases in Assam. She was at the Harvard Law School Henningsen Human Rights Fellow in 2020-21. She graduated from Nalsar University of Law, Hyderabad, and has a master's in law from Harvard Law School. They will all be in conversation with Shana Ghosh. Shana is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. She's a social anthropologist whose research, writing, and teaching are at the intersections of gender, mobility, borders, and militarism in contemporary South Asia. Her book project, 1,000 Tiny Cuts, Mobility and Security Across the India-Bangladesh Borderlands, takes a transnational feminist approach to trace how bordering historically makes relational hierarchies of value in people, places, and things. Over to you, Sahana, and once again, thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Subasri, very much for the introduction and for the invitation to be a part of this panel and to be in conversation with all of you whose important work I read and learn from, and admire tremendously. Welcome to everyone who's tuned in to listen to us. And before I say anything further, a huge thank you to the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation for, as Subasri said, for being this space where we can gather and have this kind of conversation and support the amazing work that Subasri is doing. And a big thank you to Latika and her team for all the work that's gone into getting us together here across multiple time zones to have this conversation. So Subasri started us off already by flagging a couple of the things that I wanted to start our conversation off with, which is raising the issue of citizenship, to think about citizenship beyond an event, so beyond something that can be possessed as a kind of, that is a watershed moment, a before and after. And one thing that I want to, especially as an as an ethnographer of citizenship, at a time when the stakes of the struggles of documentary citizenship is clear for all of us to see in India, but across South Asia and beyond, with the enactment of the CAA and the enforcement of the National Register of Citizens in Assam, and the possibility of that in neighboring states, of West Bengal with the elections, the kind of fear it drummed up in multiple states in India and so on. The stakes of documentary citizenship is obviously clear for all of us to see. But at the same time, what I want to, a point I want to raise for us to think about is that citizenship is a process. It's a long process. It's a legal process, and Rupali is going to speak at length about what that entails, its history, its changes in the Indian context. But in addition to it being a long legal process, it's a relationship that people have with the state, but it's also a social relationship that people have with neighbors, within families, that people have as collectives, communities have with one another. So we have to think about it in several different registers. We have to think about citizenship as a process that unfolds well before the acquisition of the fact of citizenship, long after the act of acquiring citizenship, and one that unfolds at several different registers, at the sort of legal bureaucratic register, at the social register, at the affective register, and also at the register of sort of a kind of relationship that people have with landscapes, right? Like at the material, physical landscape they live in, the fields they, the land they tend, they work, the kind of agrarian relationships they have, the buildings they inhabit or leave or aspire to return to or inhabit, right? So we must think of citizenship, and as Subasri said, and this is what I interpret Subasri's very beautiful words about presencing to mean, is that these relationships are not just forged, but uttered and presented by people in many different forms that are not legible to the state in necessarily documented forms, but that does not mean that they are present, or that does not mean that people are not uttering or making those relationships felt, or not staking those relationships, right? And those are not relationships without conflict, without contradiction, but nonetheless, those relationships between socially to, as I said, socially to landscape, to material places, to land, affective relations, So citizenship in all of these registers are constantly being worked out and being staked by people in borderlands and certainly everywhere else, right? By all people. So that's one thing I wanted to flag, and I think that's something all our speakers can certainly offer thoughts on. The second thing I wanted to raise at the outset is that while we do, it's so urgent, of course, to have these conversations about the stakes and politics of documentary citizenship. We must also pause to think about what these conversations and the terms of these conversations trap us in, right? Do we risk the danger of reproducing some of these categories of the state, right? So the citizen, the Indian, the migrant, the Bangladeshi, the illegal migrant. Are we in thinking about the citizen only in relation to a particular nation state? Are we reproducing certain statist, a statist framework and a statist analytic and a national frame, right? And so what I would put before us today is the question about thinking transnationally and what thinking transnationally about figures who inhabit these categories, right? So who is this migrant that we're talking about? Often they are young, rural, young or not. They're often rural, working class, Muslim or lower caste men. And in my research in the borderlands of northern Bengal, in the greater Cooch Behar, Rangpur region, I find that rural working class men on both sides of the border have far more to share agrarian distress, being vilified as migrants, whether it's in the cities of Dhaka, or Delhi, or Bangalore, as migrants in the city. They don't have to cross borders to be, to share many of the same concerns. And in there, as they come of age, they are nationalized. They come to be nationalized, right? And their kind of value in their national identities as Indian or Bangladeshi come to be realized in relation to one another as well, right? So I think if we are able to start thinking transnationally and think about the kinds of people who inhabit these categories, these figures that we are speaking of, we might be able to also think critically about the political work that's achieved by using these categories of the migrant, the infiltrator, the citizen, etc., that actually works to separate and disable all kinds of solidarities, right? So perhaps that's another thing that a conversation like this, a space like this can offer us. We can begin to think about what thinking transnationally across this region can offer us. What kinds of solidarities might it open up if we think about what the people who inhabit these categories actually share in their lives and livelihoods, and in what ties them to land and livelihood. And I'll leave it at that. And I really look forward to what our speakers have to share with us today, and look forward to the conversation that will be generated, that will come out of this panel. So let me begin with Malini. Huge congrats, Malini, on the publication of your book, Jungle Passports. Everybody, you're sure, if you haven't already, I urge you to go and get your copies of Malini's book, Jungle Passports, out with University of Pennsylvania Press. So let me begin by asking you, Malini, if your book, which is an academic book, if it's if it's come out of your own experience of the world and sort of your personal history growing up, if you could start us off by telling us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Sahana. Am I audible? Thank you, Sahana. Thank you, Subasri, and to all members of the foundation. It's indeed an honor to be with all of you. I'm speaking to you this evening from the lands of the Darug Nation in Australia. These lands have belonged to the Aboriginal nations, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emergent. These lands have never been ceded, and they never will. Now I'm going to begin. I'm going to very quickly share my screen with you. And I'm going to begin with an old tin trunk. We've seen this. I think most of our grandparents traveled around with this. I painted it. I inherited this from my maternal grandmother, Rani, and I painted this before we relocated. This is Rani. This is a pencil sketch of my maternal grandmother, who in 1945 hurriedly packed, her belongings and her clothes and her jewelry in 5 of these trunks and left with my grandfather and her 2 daughters to join her son and her brother, who were already in Calcutta. They left from Phoritpur near Dhaka in 1945. And the stories that I heard were about the fact that the partition happened and then they couldn't go back. It's a story that's familiar to not just people who grew up in Calcutta or in Bengal, by which I mean both sides of Bengal, but also Sindh, Punjab, Assam, and other regions of Gujarat, Rajasthan, other regions of South Asia. So this story was not exceptional. And our family came to reside in the northern part of the city. And my grandmother died when I was 9 years old. But what I remember is that she stored her shawls in these trunks, as I was growing up, and she would open them in winter, sun her shawls and use them again, and then close it, put naphthalene bowls, lock it up, and then it would be stored away during the other months. Now, years later, as an anthropologist, I was writing my dissertation at the University of Amsterdam, and I landed up in these very remote corners of the shores of Assam, which border Bangladesh. And the shores, as we know, are ecologically shifting regions where people and land, not just people, but also the land moves. And Abdul will tell us more about this. But I want to bring your attention back to the trunk, which was the first image. Let me go back to the trunk. And it was in these villages, so my intention, Sahana and I have been co-travelers in this region for many, many years. And my intention was we all know that there are undocumented Bangladeshis in Assam, and my intention was to follow one group of laborers from the fence where India had just started constructing its multi-layered fence with Bangladesh. And my intention as a dissertation student was to follow one group of laborers as they moved to Delhi or Bombay or wherever, Bangalore, wherever they were going. I didn't leave the fence. And I continued to live in these shores that bordered Bangladesh. And that is where I met people who, very much unlike my grandmother, they had similar trunks, these iron trunks, heavy iron trunks. But unlike my grandmother, they were not storing their shawls there. In these remote villages, at the very mention of the word unauthorized Bangladeshi, people would rush to their old tin trunks, open them, and take out heaps and heaps of land documents and identity documents and wave them at me and say that, our forefathers have tilled this land. We've lived here for generations. And of course, that was absolutely true, because if we know, in these kind of ecologically shifting regions where rivers swallow land without notice, swallow people, cattle, homes, and what have you. But they also gush out silt and new resources that peasants laboriously reclaim. They muscle flex and reclaim. They operate in cartels and gangs and reclaim. And then they laboriously cultivate it to grow rice, you know. And we also know from our history books that it was the labor of these moving peasantry who had lost their land to the changing course of rivers that actually supported the tea plantation economy of Assam in British India. But lo and behold, come late 1930s, what happens? You have the Muslim League in Assam and the Congress in Assam, and these shifting territories, the grazing reserves, the forested lands become a bone of contention in the kind of build-up to the partition and the demand for an independent India and Pakistan. So what happens? This is a turning point in the history of the immediate pre-partition period, in which food producers, predominantly Muslims of Bengali origin, who moved to Assam, came to be valorized as important cultivators who were contributing to the resource economy of Assam, and they came to be valorized by the Muslim League. Whereas for the Assam Provincial Congress, they were infiltrators who were coming to take on to take over the territory of Assam. And indeed, in the entire build-up to 1947, some hoped and others feared that Assam would be incorporated within Pakistan. So, growing up in Kolkata, you're very distant from the kind of everyday anxieties surrounding fragile ecologies. You grow up as a city girl. You don't want to listen to partition stories, that your grandparents talk about. And I'm going to come back to that much later. But what I want to really emphasize is that the worlds that I started exploring as an anthropologist, and especially these shifting borderlands between India and Bangladesh along Northeast India that I've studied for over a decade, exposed me to a very different set of anxieties, where questions of national legitimacy, where questions of linguistic belonging, where people's relationship to land, to cattle, to identity document, and indeed their growing rice came under extreme suspicion and state scrutiny. And long before India started building a border in Assam along Assam's borders with Bangladesh, we had a very important border in 1947, and that border was a food grain. It was rice. If you look at the intelligence reports in the period immediately following the partition, when India and Pakistan emerge as independent nation states, and Assam is in a very precarious position now, because it's absorbed within India, and yet there are all these tensions and anxieties along Assam's borders with East Pakistan. And it's really at this moment, August 1947 onwards, that rice, a grain that is grown, that is consumed as food, that is widely available, not only becomes a very scarce and a very precious commodity in these borderlands, but becomes securitized as a military issue. And that is what happened in Assam in August 1947. Until then, when Assam was a part of British India, if you look at the ways in which colonial intelligence officers were mapping these regions, military issues were related to espionage, theft of arms, etc. And rice production in August 1947 becomes militarized. It becomes a marker of citizenship. Rice trading, rice smuggling becomes an issue. So rice, in that sense, becomes one of the first borders that divide people between India and East Pakistan in 1947. And I'm going to stop with this bit of history and then maybe join the discussion later and bring some of my contemporary work with people who are suspects in the foreigners tribunals back to the discussion.
Thank you, Malini. That was wonderful, from the tin trunk of your grandmother Rani to rice wars of 1947. I'm going to turn to Abdul, if that's okay, Abdul. And sort of in the same vein, ask you to tell us a little bit about how, for you growing up in Assam, how does one reconcile sort of your kind of individual memory of history, as sort of Malini said, growing up in Calcutta, one didn't want to hear about partition. You were, city girl in Assam, or these stories about ecological disaster or ecological frailty or fragility seemed very distant. So for you growing up in Assam, how does one reconcile sort of your individual memories, your family history, your individual memories of your family, to the sort of more grander national histories of partition of the region that swirl around you? And what are the modes of narrating, of holding on to this personal history that you found most enabling and most kind of fulfilling?
Thank you, Sahana, for this very, very interesting question. Also very, it's not a very easy question to bring all of this together and answer. And I'm also thankful to Subasri, Latika, and all of other friends in the foundation. So as you mentioned that this personal story, when I was listening, the first the reaction to the city girl came to my mind is that being a rural boy, I was maybe a 6th or 7th standard student. For the first time, when I go to Guwahati to see the city, it was during my summer vacation, and I thought that I will go to Guwahati and I will write an essay after coming back from Guwahati. What I see, I will write and I will share with my teachers, my friends. But when I went to Guwahati, the Guwahati welcomed me in a very, very strange way. One day my uncle, he was a rickshaw puller. So my background is, you also talked about the ecological thing. So when my ancestors, actually my grandfather, he came from today's Bangladesh around 1920s, and the place he chose in Borpeta district is the lowland. It's not a chor, it's a river bank area, but it's very lowland. Almost 6 months of the year it remains. Still when I'm speaking, my home in Assam is surrounded by water. And the reason to select that part of was for my grandfather is that they were very, very tasty fish called koi koi mas. It's like my father, I remember my grandmother used to say that it's like this mass of koi fish, golden color, and that was one of the main reason to select that area. But now, when we are in a situation of this climate change, destruction of our environment, using pesticides, fertilizers, all of this, those fishes are gone. And on such a time when I from rural area, I went to Guwahati, and in Guwahati, I realized that I have another identity, and that identity, I never realized that beyond this area, the village, the rural environment I enjoyed, we were poor. Not only me in my village, everyone is like, almost every year we suffered the flood and all. But when I went to the Guwahati, I realized that I have another identity. I'm not just someone who is learning Assamese language, who is like, uh, feel that we are Assamese, and the young kid who dreamed to write an essay in Assamese language, to write his experience of seeing and enjoying Guwahati city, it turned into nightmare. Because as I was telling you that one day my uncle, who is a rickshaw puller, we we were going to a pharmacy uh, to for some medicine for him. And when we reached the, there's a mill, jute mill. Those who are from Guwahati, those who have visited Guwahati might be aware that there's a jute mill in Lal Ganesh. In front of that jute mill, some people were trying to push a vehicle. They asked my uncle to push. He said that I'm not well, I'm going to the pharmacy. Just he said this much, and he was abused with, words like, I won't say in the public forum, but the word Bangladeshi, Mia, all of these were used. And I realized that I have another identity, and that identity is subordinate. That identity is weaponized against us. Though at the time I didn't understand what is happening, but that was something which actually, what I'm thinking today, what I'm doing today, it I strongly feel that those incidents, and when I came back home, I saw how my uncles, my aunts, they were branded as illegal immigrants. Another uncle, his elder brother, who was abused in Guwahati, he was marked as a D voter while, attending these hearings in the tribunal. One day, he collapsed while coming back from the tribunal. He died. We were not being able to take him to the hospital as well. So we experienced these things. And you also asked me, how do we tell these stories? How do we, what kind of mode we use to narrate this story? So then I'm like, if you allow me to speak maybe another 5 to 7 minutes, then I'll come to that point. That's I'll give one example of this Mia poetry thing. What we started. So our community, when they came, as this has been discussed very well, especially Malini, as very beautifully she has explained. So for our community, they were trying to be, at peace with the local community. They learned Assamese language. They imbibed Assamese culture. Bihu become very much part of our social life. We are now accustomed to it, many traditional Assamese foods, which has become like very common to us now. But this effort to get accustomed to become Assamese, this grand project to become Assamese, along with this thing, there was another parallel process going on. That process was of violence. That violence was crowd violence as well as state violence. Malini was talking about how this tug of war between Congress and Muslim League, when Congress came to power in early 40s, there was a large-scale eviction of Muslim peasants. You see, then in 50, there was a huge riots. Official record says 53,000 families were brought back from Bengal, under the Nehru Liaquat Act. Then we see how the use of PIP, Prevention of Infiltration Act, official data says nearly 2 lakhs people were forcefully, deported to East Pakistan. And then we all know about Nelly, Nagavanda, Khagravari, all this violence, and then we also see the state violence using D-voters, like structure institutions like D-voter, border police, and then comes the NRC. And when the NRC came, it was like it's enough is enough. Now everything is in question. Your belonging is in question. Your citizenship is in question. And then there's a huge protest in 2010 in Borpeta in my home district. There's a huge protest opposing NRC. Many people that now it has like this grand consensus kind of thing that everyone wanted NRC, but nobody talked about that protest where thousands of people participated, and the state machinery, they crushed that movement brutally. 4 people were killed, and then the community realized that no, we have lost the resilience to register our protest on the street. We can't do that. There's no other way other than supporting, helping our fellow citizens to get through this test. I remember we had conducted hundreds and thousands of meetings across the state. We're training our fellow, community members to how to file the application. What are the documents needed? We were doing this. And along with this, there's another part that is how to tell these stories. And Mia poetry played a very, very significant role in this process. So in 2011, almost 1 year after killing of 4 members of the community, one poet, Shiraz Khan, he wrote a poem. So this poem here, it's a very powerful poem. I like one of my most favorite poem, where he says that Amar pulayo hikse shohorer guy. My son has also learned learned to catch like a city. So he said, he writes actually. They ask, "Oi, what is your language?" Just as the tongues of the beasts and birds have no books, my language has no school. I draw a tune from my mother's mouth. I sing Bhatieli. I match rhythm with rhythm, pain with pain, claps the sound of the land close to my heart, and speak the whispers of the sand. The language of earth is same everywhere. So what Shiraz Khan tries to do is that he nurtures the idea of universality of our pain and suffering. He moves beyond the debate of language and focus how our community has been historically marginalized, oppressed by branding as aliens, others, foreigners, all those things. So he now the most interesting part is that he is not ready to accept the contestation forever. He is asserting his own identity. He is asserting through this new genre of poetry where he believes that the educated Muslim, they're hardworking, they are not going to accept the dehumanization. He writes, "Oh, Mr. Snack Sharma, how long will you slither and slide? My son goes to the college now. He has learned to curse like the city. He knows little, but he knows well the sweet twist, and the twist turns of poetry." So these poems are translated by my friend Shalim. In 2016, Hafiz Ahmed, he is the president of Chortapuri Sahitya Parishad. He wrote a poem in Facebook where the poem is this Darwish write down I'm an Arab. That's adaptation of that poem where he's write 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 down I'm a Mia. My serial number in the NRC is 200543. I have 2 children. Another is coming next summer. Will you hate him as you hate me? Here, when he used this write down I am a Mia, it's just so powerful kind of expression through this poetry. Many people started writing poetry. And this became one of the most powerful, instrument to tell our stories. And this is not just telling our stories. What I feel is that our poets, they understand the intensity of our pain and suffering, and the requirement as a community member to stand by each other as a support in this hour of crisis. And also, find language, words, and vocabulary to articulate. I will quote two more poets, and then I will stop. So one is Ghazi Rahman. He pours in the pain and suffering in his poems, but also cries out loud for solidarity. And he uses poetry as a therapy for his ghost nation. He writes, "I don't mourn my death. I don't remember when I was alive. Look after my mother, look after my old mother, and stay well, my country." So these points are so powerful. This gives you that call for solidarity. It's a grand call for solidarity. Wherever you are, we are in a dire situation, and these are the points which actually, this spark the power, sparked in a very emotional kind of power. But we also have a poet like Kazi Sharwar Hussain. He's a very young, one of the he's one of my best Mia poets. So he through his poetry, he narrates narrates how the community is dehumanized, how we are forced to live a life of rightlessness. He talks about how our right to have rights are being violated. But he strongly writes, "This land where a skull cap is radicalization, a Mia is a subhuman, every Sorua a Bangladeshi, where the earth is weight and sold to Tatas, Biralas, and Ambani. That land is mine. I am not of that land." So I'll stop here. After reading, Kazi's poem, every time I read Kazi's poem, it makes me very emotional. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing these, Abdul. These are, so very moving. And as you say, this is clearly the language of pain, the language of, not just the way in which it's mobilized the community to express collective suffering, but also really express what you're saying, a kind of social history of this transformation from kind of trying to assimilate, as you're saying, like eat Assamese food, perform bihu, be Assamese, to a kind of real transformation. And I have many questions, and I suspect many people do, about whether this is, whether you would call this generational, whether you would, we can come back to a discussion about this. I think you raise many very, very profound questions for us, but most importantly, thank you for sharing your the particularly the verses that you hold dear with us. Rupali, if I can draw you in now and ask you to tell us a little bit about, you've been doing so much very important work in Assam with the legal clinic at Parichai. And so you've been, working sort of on the ground with the implementation, the application of the laws. But if I can ask you to cast sort of more historical eye on the evolution of citizenship laws, and the CAA is the Sixth Amendment to be made to the 1955 Citizenship Act. And so how did we get here? If you can give us a sort of whistle-stop tour, so to speak, of the amendments, of the various changes that have occurred, and give us a kind of broad overview of in what ways Assam is exceptional, in what ways are the developments in Assam not exceptional and actually very broadly applicable to India, in what ways have sort of developments in Assam steered the boat for the evolution of citizenship laws in India. That would be super helpful.
Thank you, Sahana, and thank you to Subasri for inviting me, for putting this together, to SSAF, to the panelists. It's lovely to be here. I want to especially thank Abdul for sharing that so openly, such a moving account of all of the registers that you talked about earlier on, Sahana. And to me, what is so evident in listening to all of you is just how all of this is not just illegible to the law, it's been deliberately incised out of the law. And one example I can give is that oral evidence, which is accepted in any other criminal trial, civil trial, you can be, convicted of murder on the basis of oral evidence, but oral evidence has been excluded as a basis of evidence for proving one's belonging, for proving one's citizenship before the foreigners' tribunals. That's something we're trying to contest legally at the High Court. But that is one way in which, all of the layered ways of belonging have just been removed from even possibility in terms of building your case. So I'm going to try and go through some of this history. I have a presentation to help me, but I'm going to try and really just go over the big points. So starting with after partition, citizenship was deeply contested at the time of the framing of the Constitution. It required 3 separate sessions to resolve some of these debates, and it was finally decided to come up with ad hoc principles with a specific provision that was made saying that future parliaments can alter these arrangements. The principle of jus soli, or citizenship by birth, was opposed as cheapening Indian citizenship, and attempts were made by P.S. Deshmukh to table amendments that would allow Hindus and Sikhs around the world to renounce any other nationality and claim Indian citizenship. Now, this did not win out. Nehru and Krishnaswamy Iyer especially strongly opposed these proposals, asserting that citizenship could not be linked to religious or racial elements, and attempting to distance India from misguided and backward countries. And this proposal was finally defeated on vote. So religion did not get an express place in the constitutional provisions on citizenship. However, the ad hoc provisions relating to partition did differentiate between refugees who were migrating across the newly formed international border between India and Pakistan, depending on which side they were migrating from. So Article 6 allowed all inward migrants from Pakistan to be considered as Indian citizens if they were persons of Indian origin. However, Article 7 required those who first migrated from India to Pakistan and later sought to return to India to obtain a permit for resettlement first and then apply for registration as a citizen. Both of these processes were regulated under administrative and bureaucratic procedures. And in this way, religion became coded in these different categories of refugee, intention to migrate, voluntary or involuntary travel, intention for permanent resettlement, and so on. These categories became heavily litigated in the 1950s and 60s. And in many ways, the religion of the person did shape the outcome for these tests. At the same time, it's important to consider how central property was to these legal barriers. The properties that were abandoned when persons fled for Pakistan in the first instance were taken over by the state custodian and then were meant to be reallotted to persons who were coming in as refugees across into India. Returning to claim one's property was both resisted as a matter of policy because those properties were not wished to be returned, but also seen as evidence of a false motive to seek Indian citizenship or lack of a real intention to resettle in India. So while there was no express invocation of religion in the constitutional provisions, in practice, the categories were coded in some sort of understanding of belonging that traced religious identity. By 1955, India had a citizenship legislation which provided 5 primary modes of acquiring citizenship. So the legislation originally did provide for citizenship by birth. Apart from this, there was naturalization, which was linked to residency, the period of stay in India. There was also a special provision for registration for people of Indian origin, which again did not make a distinction on the basis of religion. Running parallel to the law on citizenship are the law for foreigners, which is the Foreigners Act, which has the dreaded Section 9, which has a reverse onus. The minute you're questioned about your status as a foreigner, the onus is on you to prove that you're not a foreigner. The state doesn't have to prove why they have a ground for suspicion against you. There's also legislation that creates immigration offenses, making it a criminal offense to be in India without a visa or without other appropriate documentation. We did not have an official refugee law, but refugee policy was being unofficially implemented in the power to exempt people from the rigors of criminalization under immigration offenses and in the provision of long-term visas. And we're going to see more of that develop as we go along. In the 1980s, we've heard some of this history. A new mode for naturalization was introduced in the form of Section 6A in the Citizenship Act as a result of the Assam Accord and the Assam agitation. Following the war for liberation and the formation of Bangladesh, anxieties over takeover by the other came to a boiling point with student unions leading a 6-year-long agitation against foreigners who were described as being illegal migrants. At the same time, narratives about widespread document fraud and deliberate electoral fraud rendered anyone, including people with documents, liable for suspicion as being a foreigner. We've heard Abdul's moving testimony about how that suspicion translated in terms of people's actual experience and didn't correlate with their documentary status or when it was they actually started living in a particular place. Intriguingly, this agitation ended with a political agreement between the Prime Minister and student unions called the Assam Accord, which then became introduced in the form of legislation and a mode of acquiring citizenship. The provisions of Section 6A reads actually as an amnesty provision, effectively granting citizenship to all persons domiciled in Assam as of 24th March 1971. Even though it reads as an amnesty provision granting citizenship, it began to be applied by tribunals across the state as an exclusive Assam test or Assam standard for citizenship that any resident needed to pass, overriding citizenship by birth or other modes by which you could have acquired citizenship under the law. And this reading does not emerge from the statute. Even though it doesn't emerge from the statute, till today, the NRC in Assam was conducted on this basis, requiring all persons to prove their residence or their ancestry back to 24th March 1971 to be counted as a citizen, irrespective of whether they could have been citizens by birth. In 2003, immigration offenses were expressly linked to eligibility for citizenship by formally introducing the term illegal migrant in the citizenship law. So people who were defined as illegal migrants under the law were then barred from applying for citizenship by naturalization or registration. For the children of illegal migrants were barred from citizenship by birth. Even though this category is broadly defined as any person entering India without papers like visas or overstaying visas, it had a certain political and social meaning, which was clarified in 2015 when non-Muslims compelled to leave Pakistan and Bangladesh were exempted from the requirements of immigration law. Afghanistan was then later added to this in 2016. So their exemption from immigration law implied that they would not be in violation of immigration law when entering India without a visa or when overstaying, and hence could not be barred as illegal migrants under the law. Ethnographic studies by scholars like Farhana Ibrahim and Natasha Rahija have documented how even these Hindu refugees from 1965 and 1971 faced immense challenges in keeping their visa status up to date and having their citizenship applications cleared. They have brought in how caste has played a huge role again in the social negotiations of acceptance, with a large number of the communities who came in 65 and 71 being oppressed castes. So the timeline is introducing the category illegal migrant first to create a bar to citizenship in 2004, exempting a select group of people from this category was first done in 2015 by exempting that group from immigration offenses. But because of the ambiguity or challenges around a mere exemption from immigration offenses, the CAA was passed in December 2019, purportedly to ensure that these refugee communities would no longer face a barrier in accessing citizenship by clarifying that they were not illegal migrants under the law. So religion was expressly inserted into the citizenship law by amending the definition of illegal migrant to exclude the categories of non-Muslims from Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh who entered before 31st December 2014 and who were exempted from immigration law. The justifications for this legislation, however, were located in a vision of belonging that echoed Deshmukh's early proposal in the Constituent Assembly of a Hindu homeland in India. And when explicitly coupled with the NRC in its introduction in Parliament, it raised serious questions about whether the law was intended to facilitate access to citizenship at all, even for this select 33,000 set of refugees who living on the western border of India since the 1970s, or whether it was meant to have a signaling effect, especially to Muslims in our country. A signaling effect about belonging and about a shift in the political imagination of our democracy. The CAA is presently in effect as law, though the union has clarified that it is not in operation since they have not yet framed rules for its operation. However, since the CAA redefines a category in law, it's not clear why we need to wait for separate rules for the CAA to have an actual impact on people's cases and people's claims for citizenship. So we have seen attempts made to claim an exemption from the category of illegal migrant or claim access to naturalization or registration as citizens made by people in high courts or in citizenship applications to the MHA. In fact, the application form for citizenship by registration or naturalization includes a field where you're supposed to mention yes or no if you are a minority from these countries and if you fit within this category, essentially. So once again, we're in a position where there is ambiguity in the formal system of the law about the role of religion or the justification of invoking religion, but in practice, in the actual administration of the law, it's very clear what these coded words are intended to be. And without the citizenship amendment rules, we already are seeing successful attempts to claim citizenship based on this category or claim exemption from illegal migrant status. The Guwahati High Court last week directed someone who was a declared foreigner before the tribunal to try their hand at an application to the MHA for citizenship, citing this exemption, not citing the CA expressly, but citing this category of exempted persons. So we sort of have come back full circle in that administrative regime, which of course also plays out in the tribunal in how people's claims to citizenship are interpreted. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry for taking so much time.
Not at all. Thank you, Rupali, and thank you for so thoughtfully reflecting on what the practice of law and application of law means sort of in relation to the lived experiences of kind of protracted suspicion in the way in which Abdul shared, for example, and as you pointed out, the way in which suspicion was made widespread, institutionalized, and sort of codified into the law with the Assam Accord. At this moment, I'll just invite everyone who's been listening so patiently to all of us to please type in your comments or questions to the chat box. We have some time for discussion, so I'll be sure to bring up your questions to all the panelists. So please feel free to just type them in at the chat box. I do have a few follow-up questions, so I'll just go around and pose them. Malini, to return to your very evocative talk and the tin trunk, the images of the tin trunk you shared with us, and the early 20th century, the mid 20th century history of Assam. So how can we think about, if I were to pose the question that I asked Abdul to you, in thinking about individual memory or sort of family histories with these larger sort of social histories of regional histories. So how could we think with your grandmother's tin trunk, let's say, to the borders of Assam, and think about borders as, and you talked about the earliest border being that of a rice border, being securitized because of these, because rice became a security issue between India and Pakistan in the early years. So, how could we think about borders not just as a place of closure, but as perhaps ruptures to the nation state?
Thank you, Sahana. Great question. I'll return to your question about personal histories and national histories in a bit. And I'm going to leave my grandmother's trunk behind right now, but I'm going to return to my grandfather to answer your question very soon. Now, what my fieldwork and living along the borders of Northeast India and Bangladesh continuously revealed to me that borders continue to gather life's promises, even when nations partition landscapes and brutally divide societies. And I've always felt that despite the attendant risks, borders continually propel life's worlds of mobilities, identity, and citizenship. And these life worlds are perennially in the making. And for me, being at the border meant seeing how the powerful forces that regulate this very fragile balance between life and death at the nation's margin continue to force people to cross borders again and again. And today, more than ever before, these things are so significant. Over the past decade, and especially now with the pandemic, there's been a resurgent politics of nationalist authoritarianism. And this kind of politics locates borders at the front lines of debates on globalization, unauthorized migration, and citizenship. And Rupali has spoken about, the changing contours of citizenship and how it impacts people in terms of witnessing evidence, etc. And one of the things that I feel through conducting fieldwork in these regions is that there are these constant dense worlds of relationships that shape border lives and border societies. But borders are also location, as Abdul said. He was ethnically, linguistically, religiously, perennially at a border, and Guwahati was never near enough or known enough for him. So this borders for me are also sites where a sense of being constantly uprooted and rendered less than human lingers, and by virtue of their location, whether it be religious location, geographic location, ethnic location, the loyalty of people who live along borders are always, cast in suspicion. And this is, there's a dynamism, and there are tugs and pulls that hold people together across national territories. To return to your point about transnationality, and these ties are also far beyond blood. They're not just about divided families, right? And it's because of these tugs and pulls, borders and borderlands are also sites where there is an enduring sense of danger and loss that continually lingers. And I want to just take 30 seconds and quickly share my screen again and introduce you to Harendra Lal, my, where did this go? And I'll keep this really brief in the interest of time. This is Harendra Lal. So I started my presentation, my maternal grandfather, I started my presentation with Rani, my grandmother, packing everything in 4 trunks and leaving, right? In 1945, all right? And all the stories that I heard were about how they could never return back. But what were they returning to? And this is the other part of the story that I wanted to tell you. In 1944, Harendra Lal was poisoned by his brothers and his cousins over, he was a very simple man. Unlike my grandmother, he was a simpleton, They poisoned him and they put him on a boat and they floated in the river. This sounds straight like out of a Bollywood film, but it's true. Harendra Lal was floating on the river, semi-unconscious and foaming in his mouth, when a group of fisherfolk identified him and they transferred him to their boat and they got him back. They knew who he was. Ever since then, Harendra Lal never quite recovered from this horrible personal betrayal and tragedy. He was never quite the same man in Kolkata that he was in Phorikpur. My grandmother, on her part, continued to live with her in-laws and relatives from his side, embracing them with a lot of compassion and a lot of love. And I grew up hearing that it was the partition that was responsible for all the the misfortunes that they faced subsequently in North Calcutta, where they lived. But this sense of personal, you had a personal tragedy, you had deceit, you had treachery in a family that got completely overshadowed by this epiphanic moment in which a borderline came to divide India and Pakistan. And all that was problematic within these feuds in the family came to be ascribed to this larger political event. And when I was sitting in the foreigners' tribunals, I sat in 2 of these foreigners' tribunals, Rupali, and you've brought out, the kind of anxieties, fears, and persecutions that people talk about. That's exactly what the NRC has done. It has ruptured family ties. I was sitting in these tribunals and there were people who were coming and saying that their brothers had filed cases about them as suspected Bangladeshi foreigners to take over property. So rather than my grandmother's tin trunk. It was my grandfather's life that was continually being replayed in these tribunals, and the power of a highly exclusionary law and the power of an index and a register to fracture family ties, to fracture filial ties, to fracture a sense of community. And that is what I'm going to leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you, Malini. I think that this point about kind of multiple borders sometimes echoing one another, refracting one another, as you know, Abdul, the kind of borders, the distance between your village and Guwahati being much greater perhaps than the border between the international militarized border between India and Bangladesh, and what's at stake in crossing them. Sometimes borders are embodied, right? So sometimes no matter where you go, you are always the person that's being surveilled and sort of policed and sought to be pinned down. And absolutely, and to the point about, and Rupali, your sort of the laying out this long arc is so appreciated, because I think it helps us really grasp or mull over, as I said, the ways in which Assam and Malini, you're talking about the ways in which the foreigners tribunals in Assam are very, very particular to Assam, absolutely, and the ways in which they bring out these schisms, or it gives communities, families, all kinds of political vendettas, all kinds of various interests, a reason to invite the state, right, what is codified in state law, into intimate spheres of homes, neighborhoods, intimate spaces. But I think it's also not exceptional to Assam, right? So there are ways in which this is a much broader phenomenon that is neither confined to Assam and nor confined to the time of the NRC, right? The specific time space of the NRC. So the electoral rolls, for example, are revised every year. So so the more broadly, the Foreigners Act allows people to be held on. It's a non-bailable act where the burden of proof is on those suspected and arrested of being a foreigner and not being a bona fide citizen. And in much like your research in Assam, in the Assam borderlands, Malini, in mine, and the district courts of Kuch Bihar, similarly, I've sat through hearings being heard under the Foreigners Act, where neighbors who know each other, have lived next to each other for generations, are submitting to electoral commission, to panels of the electoral commission, that they suspect one another to be potential Bangladeshis, right? To all kinds of other ends. All this to say, and this cuts across the binaries of Hindu or Muslim alone, right? So it might be Muslims rendering Hindus suspicious and vice versa as well. And this brings me back. And so we have to think about the ways in which these lines are complicated, and the law is, and as Rupali was saying, the complications of the law are brought into intimate spaces of people's lives and vice versa, right? That the complicated ways in which people live suspicion, and the complicated ways in which that this suspicion tears the social fabric, the law is unable to, and you're arguing, your work leads you to argue the law willfully refuses to recognize that and consider that. And so I wanted to ask you, Abdul, so much of what you've shared today has allowed us to reflect on this. If you could tell us a little bit let me see if there's a question. You, Abdul and Rupali, if you could tell us a little bit about language and ethnicity, right? Like, so the ways in which both of you have, your remarks today have really, I think, also helped complicate the more simplistic sort of national narrative about the CAA or NRC being sort of simply a binary between a sort of Hindu-Muslim issue, right? I think in Assam, those kind of breakdown and language and ethnicity complicate the question of belonging, both in terms of an evidentiary regime, but Abdul, in the way you've talked about it, also the way in which belonging has perhaps been felt and changed over generations, in the way it's both been felt and the way in which it's been expressed and staked, claims have been staked. So if you want to offer some remarks on that.
Actually, I'm tempted to bring in a new perspective here. So your question given me an opportunity to bring in, what I have not spoke in my earlier thing. So that is when we talk about the language, and can you hear me? Okay. So when we talk about language and ethnicity and the current CAA and NRC debate, national and state level, what I can say is that what is we are seeing in today's India, this CAA, that is actually a little bit modification of what we had in Assam for a long time. So in Assam, under the basis of Assamese nationalism, both Muslims and Bengali Hindus were seen as outsiders, others, and in this business, Muslims, to some extent, when they were actively saying that we are Assamese, Assamese language is close to our heart, we are writing Assamese, learning Assamese. For Assamese nationalists, Muslims were to some extent tolerable. Bengali Hindus were not. And today, the same frame, same format, same design is at the hand of Hindu nationalists. For Hindu nationalists, Hindus are others in Assam, but they are tolerable others. Muslims are not. So this is very interesting. And also when Mia poets are also writing in local dialect, that gives another a layer of at one hand for the community, it's an opportunity, it's a must to feel the pain, to tell the story. On the other hand, for those who have the power, who are deciding, who are like taking decisions on citizenship, or who are taking decision of other things, for them this is a weapon that these people are not Assamese. They're not Assamese. So we should teach them a lesson. So language is of course playing a very important role, but we must understand that what we are seeing today in national context, this CAA and NRC, this is the gift of Assamese nationalism. And the Assamese nationalism is not based on religion, it's based on language.
I have a slightly different response, so I feel like that's a provocative moment that we need to take up. I just quickly share my comment, which is to say that I don't actually see the legal architecture of the regime in Assam as exceptional at all. In fact, my colleague Darshana has argued that it's a prototype. We all need to be learning the system, not only for what's going on in Assam, but also to anticipate what's going to happen everywhere else. We've already seen that in the NRC conversation. We're going to see that in the Foreigners Tribunal conversation as well. Recently, the Patna High Court passed an order against a person who was found to be a survivor of trafficking, where there is a specific international treaty between India and Bangladesh on people who are survivors of trafficking and their repatriation, completely ignoring all of that and directing that this person be treated as an illegal migrant and sent to detention as a foreigner, despite the absence of a detention center in Bihar. So this is, this legal regime is a template infused with discretion, devoid of dignity and due process, where these categories, illegal migrant or foreigner, can be infused with whatever version of the other it is that is relevant in whichever part of the country we're talking about. And the other is becoming more and more clearly defined in terms of religion.
Great, thank you, Rupali. We're running a bit short on time, so I'm going to take one question from the audience here. Darshana Mitra, thank you for a wonderful session. I find it interesting that the word migrant or Bengalis of migrant origin are frequently used to describe Bengali Muslims in Assam, whereas refugee is the term invoked for Hindus who came to West Bengal from Bangladesh, despite the former category, i.e. Muslims, Bengali Muslims arriving much earlier. These categories are now, as Rupali showed, being reified through the law. How do we critically examine these terms and their use to reinforce certain notions of legitimate, illegitimate movement? Would any of you, several historians have written about the history of these terms. I'm going to write a couple of references in the chat box here, but Malini, would you like to address that?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. You're absolutely right in reminding us how, Hindu Bengalis became legitimate as citizens in independent India, as contrasted with Bengalis, Muslims of Bengali origin in Assam and other places. But just to bring the question of legitimacy, illegitimacy, just to foreground it regionally a little more, remember Bengali Hindus were not welcome as refugees in either Assam or even in West Bengal. People were pushed to the islands of Morijhapi, as Onu Jale reminds us. People were sent as conscripted workers. Refugees were settled in Andamans, as Uditi Sen reminds us. And Shekhar Bandyopadhyay has written about what happened to the low-caste Bengali refugees on account of partition. The other thing that we need to remember when we are talking about Assam, and this is something that we forget, that you already had generations of Muslims residing in Assam who were legitimate Assamese. They were descendants of the Mughal prisoners of war. And the so-called quote-unquote Mia Muslims that Abdul referred to. I mean, Mia is a word that is not used pejoratively anywhere else in India except Assam, I think. It is used to convey religion, but it is also a mark of respect. Mia can be used in a way to address respect, whereas Mia Muslim is a very pejorative category to demarcate Assamese Muslims from Muslims of Bengali origin. And these are categories that are coming into question now. And, the kind of legitimacy that Muslims in Assam who are non-Mia Muslims took for granted are going to be under scrutiny given the kind of times that we are living in. So that is something that we are going to be seeing unfolding in the times to come.
There's a question on parallels between the citizenship issues in the subcontinent and the global migrations of recent years, including the popular sentiments underlying Brexit. So sort of more broadly, the rise of popular nationalism, xenophobia, the inwardness. I think these are themes that have been remarked on, especially by you, Malini, and you, Rupali, in your comments. I think just now what you said were very instructive about the way in which you think. If I may paraphrase in response to the question, that you don't think Assam is exceptional at all, but that it is actually a template. I think that was very instructive, and we can think about that as actually a kind of module of form taking shape in many parts of the world. The ways in which deportations, border enclosures, the surveillance of migrants, and the incarceration of migrants of all kinds is taking place in across the world. Can the CA, CAB, or NRC be retrospective? Malini or Abdul, would you like to address that question with reference to the 3,000 Chakma and Hajong settled in the northeast, in the Nefa in 1960s, who were from the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh?
Yeah, so one of the things to remember, again, to go back to partition, and here I'm thinking about Willem von Schendel's work. When partition happened, nobody knew where Radcliffe's line actually came to be placed. And the Chakmas in the Chittagong Hill Tracts thought that they were going to be placed in India. So August 15, 1947, they put up the Indian flag. And since then, of course, first by Pakistan and then by Bangladesh, they've been a suspected Buddhist minority. And indeed, both the Hajongs, and the Hajongs again are neither caste nor tribe. They are neither, they are very devout Hindus, who were caught in the kind of long partition, as Wazira Zamindar calls it, the kind of partition that we continue to live with even today. And, the question of refugee resettlement, coming back to, is it something that is happening globally? Yes, of course, as Sahana said, if you look at the ways in which Europe's borders are being policed, the ways in which migrants are dying along the US-Mexico border, and the increasing risks under which people are feeling compelled to cross borders, you see that this is quite a global phenomenon. And you also see, and it's not just Assam, as Rupali and all of you have been talking about, look at the question of refugee resettlement along various states of Northeast India. These have been very contentious. Nobody wants refugees. When refugees have arrived, people have the other thing that we need to remember with regard to the global question is that, although the movement of refugees may seem global, but developing nations accommodate the world's most refugees. The largest numbers of refugees are in poor countries, are in developing nations. They're not in Europe. If you look at the kind of refugee settlements we've done in Australia, they're far less than any kind of quota. I believe the quota for Afghanistan is just 3,000. And it's very important, I mean, who becomes a citizen, think about the 60,000 Sri Lankan Tamil refugees who are on the outskirts of Chennai. The second generation doesn't have citizenship documents, right? So it's a very contested and a fraught field, both in relationship to the host societies where refugees are forced to resettle, as well as with regard to questions of identity, documents, and citizenship.
Thank you, Malini. I'm going to
I
wrap
think
up and
Rupali, maybe she wanted to respond then. Yeah.
Just one quick comment on the retrospective question.
Mhm.
The NRC already incorporates retrospective elements of the law. Like I talked about, there was citizenship by birth. People were born at a time when they were entitled to citizenship by birth. And then you have the NRC, first you have the 2003 amendment introducing the category of illegal migrant, and then the NRC excluding that category, effectively undoing the citizenship by birth that people carried up to the point that that amendment came in. So my answer to that would be that if you go by precedent, you can do whatever you want to the citizenship law and create any category, retrospective or prospective. It would not be constitutional. It should not pass the test of constitutionality. But has it been done? Yes. And can it be done? It can be done. And on the comparisons with Brexit, I just want to make one tiny point about how far back historically we're continuously looking in the Assam context. You know, someone who is tracing movement to the 1920s is still being described as a migrant and still justifying their movement and their roots. And as someone who grew up in a part of India where my parents were not, from, I never had to do that. I never had to think back to a moment, definitely not a moment 100 years in the past. And I think that's what's quite unique about this, like the surviving, pervasive tag of migrant, even though the movement was generations before.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening, staying with us till the end. We're over time, so I'm going to bring us to a close. And just reflecting on, and your questions have asked us to reflect on the way in which borders and regimes of enclosure, carceral systems echo one another globally. But also, as I would be remiss to not remark on the way in which, on the note I began, and the very powerful and important points raised by and verses shared by Abdul, where he shows us that resistance poetry also have transnational lives and also echo and echo one another globally, and so that we have that too to hold on to and to build on, and as with the verse by Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, and the circulation and power of Mia poetry and what that means for the struggles for citizenship in Assam today and in the future. Good luck, Subasri, with your project, and we'll all be tuning into your subsequent panels and be following your project with great interest. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this space. Thank you for bringing us together, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Sahana. Good evening, everyone. By way of introduction, I'm Gayatri Rupali, Associate Director at SSAF. On behalf of SSAF, I would like to thank all the panelists for agreeing to be part of this engaging online discussion. Thank you, Subasri Krishnan, Malini Su, Abdul Kalam Azad, Rupali Samuel, and Sahana Ghosh. I thank the audience for joining us from different parts of the world and time zones and for their attention. I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce our colleagues at SSAF and thank them for their contribution to this event. Gil is Archives Manager at SSAF and has designed the invitation and managed the technical aspects. Saurav is here. And Malvika Madgulkar, Assistant Editor, Publications and Communications, has handled the communications for this event. And she's also here. Santosh Sani is our Accounts Executive. Please do visit our website, ssaf.in, and follow us on social media for updates about forthcoming programs. Thank you all again for joining us today.
Thank you.